The wind off Narragansett Bay carried the sharp scent of iron and salt that morning, mingling with the rhythmic clanging of shipyard hammers. The gray sky hung low, mirroring the unease that had settled over Rhode Island after the radio announced Pearl Harbor's destruction. The whole town seemed to vibrate with a single thought. War had arrived, and no one knew what would come next. Eleanor Ellie Carter stood at the edge of the naval construction yard, coat buttoned to her throat, her gloved hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee gone lukewarm. At 28, she was the youngest civil engineer in the department, and the only woman. Her auburn hair was pulled tightly beneath a wool cap, though stubborn curls escaped at her temples. Her eyes, a stormy gray-green, held a constant tension between intellect and exhaustion. Her father used to call her the girl who dreams in blueprints. But these days, the dreams came in shades of ash and smoke. The yard buzzed with activity. Cranes groaned, steel beams swung through the fog, and workers shouted over the din. Ellie watched a half-finished warehouse rise on the far pier, its skeletal frame black against the morning mist. She couldn't help noticing the inefficiency in the process, the delays, the wasted motion. Her mind, always restless, began calculating faster ways to complete the structure, ways to simplify, to adapt. "Carter!" a voice barked. Commander Richard Hall strode toward her, trench coat flapping like an angry flag. He was tall and broad, with the stiff posture of a man carved from regulation itself. His hair was iron gray, his jaw perpetually clenched. Rumor said he'd lost his younger brother at Pearl Harbor, and the grief had hardened into the steel that now ran through his veins. "Sir," Ellie replied, straightening instinctively. He stopped in front of her, studying her as if assessing a faulty machine. "You're the one with the designs for modular structures, aren't you?" "Yes, sir. I proposed a prefabricated storage unit system for coastal installations." "I've read it," Hall interrupted. "Too light for combat conditions. But headquarters in Washington has a new initiative. They need something that can be built fast, anywhere, by anyone. Portable, durable, self-supporting. We're losing men because we can't shelter them in time." Ellie's pulse quickened. "You're talking about field structures?" "I'm talking about survival," Hall said. "We need an answer before the next wave of deployment. You're being reassigned to Quonset Point, the Navy's Experimental Construction Division. Report tomorrow." He turned to leave, then hesitated. "Ann Carter, try not to make this another experiment that looks better on paper than it does in a storm." Ellie watched him walk away through the mist, her heart pounding with something between fear and defiance. She knew what he meant. She'd spent 3 years fighting to be taken seriously in rooms full of men who looked at her diploma and saw an accident. Every meeting felt like walking a tightrope, too assertive, and she was arrogant, too cautious, and she was weak. That night, in her small apartment above a hardware store, Ellie spread her sketches across the dining table. The lamplight glowed over a sea of lines and measurements. She traced her finger along a design for an arch structure she'd been playing with for months, curved panels that distributed force evenly, simple enough to assemble without cranes. The shape was inspired by the hull of a ship and the ribcage of a whale. She'd seen both survive storms that splintered everything else. As she worked, a soft meow interrupted her concentration. A black cat with a white patch on its chest jumped onto the table, tail flicking disapprovingly at the clutter. "Don't judge me, Jasper," Ellie murmured, scratching his chin. Jasper was a stray she'd found during a rainstorm 2 years earlier, and he'd appointed himself her silent companion ever since. Her mind wandered as she sketched, thoughts of her father, a bridge builder who had died in a construction collapse when she was 16. "Never trust the world to hold," he'd told her once, "unless you've tested it yourself." It was why she'd chosen this life of steel and math, even when everyone told her it wasn't for women. But tonight, the task felt bigger than equations. It felt like the weight of the entire war rested on the integrity of her lines. The next morning, Quonset Point Naval Air Station loomed before her like an iron city by the sea. Warehouses, hangars, and skeletal test frames dotted the landscape. Inside Building 23, she met the team she'd be leading, or rather, trying to lead. First was Samuel Sam Ortiz, a mechanical engineer from Chicago, tall and wiry with calloused hands and an easy grin that failed to hide the cigarette burns on his sleeve. He'd worked on railroad bridges before the war and spoke with the kind of confidence that could turn arrogance on bad days. Didn't expect the boss to have lipstick, he muttered under his breath. Then there was Martha Lynn, a meticulous draftsman barely 21, with round glasses and ink-stained fingers. Shy but precise, she had a mind that saw geometry like poetry. Ellie sensed in her a quiet ally. And Tom Brennan, a welder built like a furnace, with shoulders broad enough to block the sun. His right forearm bore a jagged scar, a relic from a factory explosion that had taken 2 co-workers. Since then, Tom had spoken little, his grief folded inward into steady hands and wordless loyalty. Ellie addressed them with a voice steadier than she felt. We're building something that doesn't exist yet. The Navy needs portable housing that can withstand wind, rain, snow, and maybe artillery. It has to be simple enough for 6 men to assemble, without machinery, and it has to ship flat. Sam whistled low. That's impossible. Ellie looked him in the eye. Then let's make the impossible stand upright. Days blurred into nights. The team sketched, argued, and experimented. The prototype began as rough steel ribs bolted into a semicircle. They tested different materials, corrugated sheets, aluminum, even plywood. But only steel survived the wind tunnel. Ellie watched every test with her stomach in knots, half praying, half calculating. One evening, Hall visited the workshop. Progress? He demanded. Ellie pointed to the curved frame gleaming under the lamps. We call it the arch unit. It channels pressure down its sides instead of against them, like a bridge turned upside down. Hall crossed his arms. Bridges don't have to move across the Pacific. No, sir, she replied, but soldiers do. He studied her for a long moment before nodding once. You'll have your field test next week. Prove it can survive a Rhode Island storm. When the nor'easter came, it howled across the coast like a living thing. Rain lashed the panels, wind screamed through the test field. The skeletal buildings around the prototype groaned and tore apart. Ellie stood in the observation shed, soaked to the bone, watching her creation bow, but not break. For 6 hours, the storm punished it, and when dawn broke, the arch stood firm, water streaming down its silver skin. Hall approached her, boots crunching over debris. Well, Carter, he said, seems you've built a survivor. She exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath all night. We built it, sir. For the first time, a flicker of something like respect crossed his face. Then you'll lead the prototype program. Report to Washington next week. Congratulations, Lieutenant. As he left, Ellie turned toward the rising sun glinting off the wet steel, her reflection curved in its surface, small, determined, and a little afraid. She whispered to herself, let's see how far we can go. Jasper meowed beside her, unimpressed as ever. The wind carried the scent of salt and possibility. The war had called, and she had answered. Rain hammered against the tin roof of the Quonset Point warehouse, echoing like the relentless ticking of an impatient clock. The cold crept into everything, the walls, the metal beams, even the bones of those working inside. The Atlantic wind howled through gaps in the siding, carrying the scent of salt and oil. It was December 1941, and war fever gripped the air as tightly as the frost that bit at their fingers. Eleanor Ellie Carter stood at the center of the cavernous space, her breath forming pale ghosts in the dim light. The workshop smelled of welding smoke, damp wood, and strong coffee. A chalkboard stood at one end, covered with equations and messy sketches of arcs and supports. Piles of corrugated steel sheets leaned against the walls like sleeping beasts, waiting to be awakened by hammer and flame. Around her, the team worked with grim focus. Samuel Sam Ortiz, the mechanical engineer, was crouched beside a half-welded frame, cigarette dangling from his lips. His dark brown skin glistened with sweat despite the cold, and his sharp eyes flicked between the steel plates and his tools with a mechanic's instinct. Sam's easy charm had dulled over the past week of failures. A former railway builder, he was a man who had grown used to solving problems with grit and quick thinking. But the war had taken his younger brother to the Pacific, and though Sam never spoke of it, Ellie could see the pain behind his forced grin. Near the drafting table, Martha Lynn hunched over a set of drawings. The glow of a desk lamp softened her youthful face. Ink stains bloomed like bruises on her fingers, and her short black hair curled around her ears in defiance of her constant attempts to pin it back. Martha rarely raised her voice, but when she did, her words carried quiet precision. She treated geometry as language, the compass and straight edge her tools of poetry. At the welding station, Tom Brennan adjusted his helmet and lit the torch. The light flared blue and white, reflecting off his scarred forearm. His massive frame moved with surprising grace for a man his size. The burn mark that ran down his right arm had been left by molten metal years ago, an accident that had taken 2 of his friends and almost his own life. Since then, Tom worked like a man in penance, steady, silent, letting his skill speak where words failed. The 4th member of the team, Henry Washington, was new, a structural engineer drafted from Chicago only 2 days earlier. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with skin the color of warm earth, and eyes that carried both kindness and fatigue. In his mid-30s, Henry had the look of a man who had fought too many unseen battles, not all of them on blueprints. Born in Georgia, he'd learned early what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated. His deep voice held the weight of both intelligence and restraint. "The angle's wrong again," he muttered, squinting at a bending beam. "It keeps folding under. Compression." Ellie stepped closer, brushing dust from her coat. "Because it's not the angle that's wrong. It's the load distribution." She ran a hand over the warped metal, feeling its cold defiance. "We're fighting the wind instead of letting it flow." Sam groaned, rubbing his temples. "You talk like the wind has manners, Ellie. It doesn't flow. It tears. It screams. You can't reason with it." "Maybe not," Ellie replied, "but you can listen to it." Her voice carried quiet conviction. The men exchanged looks but said nothing. They'd seen her stare at diagrams for hours, tracing invisible lines with her fingertips, as though she could feel the structure breathe beneath the paper. She didn't lead like other engineers, no shouting, no ego. Instead, she carried an intensity that pulled others toward her, like gravity itself. The day dragged on. They tested another prototype, straight walls reinforced with steel braces. When the wind machine roared to life, the frame shuddered and collapsed in under a minute. Sam threw his welding mask to the ground. "That's the 4th failure this week," he shouted. Ellie watched the twisted metal silently, her face unreadable. Inside, though, frustration boiled. Every collapse felt like a personal accusation, that she wasn't strong enough, smart enough, that her place here was an error the universe would soon correct. She walked to the edge of the wreckage, knelt, and touched the broken seam. Her fingers traced the curve where the metal had folded inward. "It always breaks at the joint," she murmured. "Where one plane fights another." Henry joined her, crossing his arms. "Because flat panels can't resist bending. They're fighting the load instead of carrying it." Ellie looked up, eyes flashing with sudden realization. "Exactly. We're trying to build walls when we should be building waves." Martha blinked, confused. "Waves?" "Curves," Ellie said, standing. "What if the structure isn't fighting the wind, but guiding it? Like the hull of a ship or the shell of a turtle. Nature doesn't build with corners. It builds with curves." Sam frowned, but a spark of curiosity lit his eyes. "You're saying we use arches instead of walls?" "Not just arches. A continuous curve, corrugated steel, shaped to spread stress evenly." Her voice trembled with excitement. The curve could absorb the impact, not resist it. Henry scratched his chin, his brow furrowed in thought. A self-supporting arch, no beams, no frames, just tension and compression in harmony. Tom let out a low whistle. "That's damn ambitious." Ellie smiled faintly. "So was the bridge at Brooklyn. Let's make something that stands." Over the next 3 days, the team worked without rest. The warehouse transformed into a symphony of sparks, hammer strikes, and shouted calculations. Martha adjusted the curvature ratios, Sam tested panel joints, Henry recalculated load tolerances. Even Tom began to hum as he welded, the arc light dancing like lightning in the dark. Ellie barely slept. She watched the curve take shape, a half-cylinder of corrugated steel, 20 feet long and 10 feet wide, gleaming under the floodlights. She ran her hand along the surface, feeling the rhythm of its ridges. It reminded her of her father's words. Never trust the world to hold unless you've tested it yourself. By the end of the week, the prototype stood on its own. They nicknamed it Ellie's Shell, though she protested. "It's everyone's shell," she insisted, but Sam just grinned. "Too late, boss. Name's already stuck." The test came sooner than expected. A storm rolled in from the Atlantic, a nor'easter fierce enough to tear roofs from barns and send waves crashing over the seawall. The command center ordered an evacuation, but Ellie refused to leave. "This is it," she told her team. "If it can't survive this, it doesn't deserve to exist." Rain fell in sheets as the wind howled like a living thing. The experimental structures around the test field crumpled one by one. Steel snapped like twigs. Ellie, soaked and trembling, stood in the observation shed beside Henry, Sam, and Martha. Lightning split the sky, revealing Ellie's shell standing alone in the chaos, its curved body deflecting the wind, the rain streaming harmlessly down its sides. For 6 hours, they watched it endure. When dawn broke, the storm passed, and the test field was a graveyard of twisted wrecks, except for one shining arch of corrugated steel standing unbroken. Sam laughed, breathless. "I'll be damned, she's still standing." Ellie stepped outside, boots sinking into the mud. She touched the cold surface of the structure, her reflection rippling across the curve. Relief flooded her chest, mixing with disbelief and quiet pride. She whispered, "You held." Henry joined her, his deep voice steady. "It's not just steel anymore, Ellie. It's a promise." She nodded, rain still dripping from her lashes. In that moment, she realized it wasn't perfection she had built. It was survival, shaped by courage and wind. The war had taken so much, but here, in this curve of steel, stood proof that something could endure. The morning heat in Guam felt like standing inside a furnace wrapped in mist. The air was thick, clinging to skin and clothing, carrying the heavy scent of salt, diesel, and tropical decay. A line of Quonset huts curved along the edge of the military base like silver shells left behind by some enormous creature of the sea. They gleamed beneath the sun, sweating with condensation, their corrugated sides catching flashes of light from the restless Pacific. Eleanor Ellie Carter shaded her eyes with a hand streaked with grease. The steel beneath her palm was hot to the touch, humming faintly from the heat. She was leaner now than she had been in Rhode Island, her once pale skin bronzed by months of sun and sea air. Her dark auburn hair, usually tied neatly in a bun, had surrendered to the island humidity, curling rebelliously around her face. She wore a khaki engineer's uniform, sleeves rolled up, boots scuffed, collar undone. The men on base called her Miss Steele, half in jest, half in awe. The base commander, Colonel James Rourke, stood beside her, arms crossed. He was a barrel-chested man in his early 50s, his sun-bleached mustache thick as rope, his skin leathered from decades under open skies. There was a permanent squint in his ice-blue eyes, the kind a man gets from seeing too much sun and too much death. "Never thought I'd see the day we'd be sleeping in tin cans," he muttered, his voice gravelly but not unkind. Ellie smiled faintly. "They're not tin cans, Colonel. They're engineered arches, self-supporting, aerodynamic, and cheap." Rourke snorted. "Cheap, huh? The Navy likes that word." He paused, surveying the neat rows of huts. "But I'll be damned, they go up faster than anything I've seen. My boys love 'em. You built good homes here, Miss Carter." Homes. The word struck something deep inside her. These weren't houses of comfort. They were sanctuaries of survival. She'd watched soldiers eat, sleep, and even perform surgeries beneath these steel curves. Each hut had its own heartbeat, one filled with laughter, another with coughing, another with prayer. She sometimes walked the base at night, hearing the hum of voices beneath the domes, and thought, "They're alive because of this." Nearby, Private Tom Leland, a lanky 19-year-old with freckles and a permanent nervous grin, was hammering down the last anchor bolts of a new hut. Sweat streamed down his neck. He looked up as Ellie passed. "Ma'am, we got word from the Eastern Ridge. They want 3 more shells before week's end." "3 more?" Ellie asked. "Yes, ma'am, for the medics. They lost 2 tents in last night's wind." Ellie nodded. "Tell them we'll deliver by Friday, and remind them to reinforce their anchors this time. Use the extra rods we shipped in." "Yes, ma'am." Tom snapped a salute, though his arm wobbled with exhaustion. Rourke chuckled. "They follow. You better than they follow me." "They follow the work," Ellie said simply. Later that afternoon, she found herself inside one of the hut's turned infirmary. The air smelled of iodine and iron. Lieutenant Grace Holloway, the nurse in charge, moved briskly between the rows of cots. She was tall and sharp-featured, her blonde hair pinned beneath a sweat-stained cap, her blue-gray eyes clear but weary. Her voice was soft but carried authority. "Keep the dressings dry, Private, and drink more water, not coffee." She glanced at Ellie and smiled. "You're the famous Miss Carter, aren't you? I should thank you. These domes saved my nurses more times than I can count. The tents we had before, you'd wake up with the roof in your lap after a storm." Ellie smiled, though there was a flicker of discomfort behind it. Praise felt strange. She hadn't built for gratitude. She'd built because she couldn't stand watching things collapse. That night, the air felt different, thicker, uneasy. The horizon glowed with lightning far out at sea. Rourke joined her outside the command hut, binoculars hanging from his neck. "Barometer's dropping fast," he said. "Typhoon's heading straight for us. They say it's the worst one this season." Ellie's heart tightened. "How long do we have?" 6 hours, maybe less. By midnight, the storm arrived like an angry god. The first gust hit with the force of a cannon blast, tearing palm trees from their roots. The wind screamed, howled, roared, a beast with 1,000 voices. Sheets of rain slammed the ground so hard it bounced. Ellie stood in the doorway of the storage hut, water streaming down her face, watching chaos unfold through the darkness. Wooden barracks splintered like matchsticks. Trucks rolled. Tents vanished into the black sky. She shouted over the roar. "Where are the men?" Rourke's voice thundered back. "Most took cover in your huts." The words hit her chest like a punch. Her huts. Her responsibility. She grabbed a flashlight and waded into the storm. The rain blinded her, each drop a needle. The beam of light cut through the chaos, catching glimpses. Metal arches holding firm against the wind, their curves shedding the pressure like water off a whale's back. She saw soldiers crouched inside, their faces lit by lanterns, their eyes wide but alive. One hut near the shoreline began to buckle, its anchors ripped loose, rolling the structure like a toy. Ellie ran toward it, slipping in the mud. 2 soldiers pulled her back. "Ma'am, it's gone. You can't save it," she screamed over the gale. "Then save the next one." Hours passed like minutes. By dawn, the storm had spent itself. Silence fell heavy and eerie. The sea was a boiling gray, the air thick with salt and smoke. Ellie stepped outside, her body trembling with exhaustion. The base was unrecognizable. Wooden buildings flattened, vehicles overturned, palm trees snapped in half. But there, amid the wreckage, stood her huts, 43 of 47, still upright. Their silver bodies gleamed beneath the first rays of sun, steaming like living creatures breathing after the storm. Rourke approached, his uniform torn, his hat gone, his voice cracked. "We counted. 43 made it. The rest, God help us, they didn't stand a chance." Ellie couldn't speak. She walked toward the nearest hut, touched its curved wall, warm now under the sunrise. Inside, soldiers were emerging, blinking, alive. A nurse hugged a young private, both crying. Laughter and sobbing mingled in the morning air. For a moment, Ellie just stood there, her throat tight. The weight of all the night spent sketching, the doubts, the ridicule, it all came crashing over her in one silent wave. They lived, she thought. They lived because of this. Rourke stepped beside her. "I'll be sending word to command. They'll want 10,000 more of these, maybe more. Whatever you need, materials, men, you'll have it." Ellie didn't answer. She was staring at the horizon where the sun rose over the broken base, its light glinting off the curves of steel like 1,000 small miracles. Her chest ached, but it wasn't sadness. It was something deeper, something close to faith. As she stood there, surrounded by ruin and survival, she realized she hadn't just built a shelter. She had built a promise that even in the face of chaos, something human, something hopeful, could endure. The first snow of December 1945 fell softly over Providence, Rhode Island, turning the city's war-worn rooftops into something resembling peace. Ellie Carter stood on the platform of Union Station, her suitcase at her feet, breath curling white in the cold. The whistle of the departing train echoed like a ghost of the war, one that had carried her halfway across the world and back again. Her reflection in the frosted window startled her. Thinner, older, lines of exhaustion framing eyes that once sparkled with the reckless ambition of youth. The war was over, yet the silence it left behind was deafening. Ellie's mother, Margaret Carter, waited near the gate, wrapped in a gray wool coat and holding a steaming thermos. Margaret was in her late 50s, her hair gone silver, but her eyes still sharp and searching. She had once been a schoolteacher, patient yet unbending, a woman who endured her husband's death in the Depression with quiet dignity. When she saw Ellie, she smiled, small, careful, as though afraid her daughter might vanish again. "You're really home," she whispered, pressing the thermos into Ellie's hands. "Coffee, the way you used to like it." Ellie smiled faintly. "Still 3 sugars?" Margaret nodded. Some habits shouldn't change, but everything else had. The streets were full of uniforms, soldiers returning, arms around wives and sweethearts, children clutching fathers they barely remembered. Yet beneath the joy ran a deeper anxiety. There were no homes, too many men, not enough roofs. The newspapers called it the Veterans Crisis. Ellie saw it everywhere. Tents pitched in city parks, families crammed into attics, newlyweds sleeping in cars. Providence looked like a battlefield of a different kind. A week later, Ellie sat in the back of a town hall meeting where the mayor droned on about housing shortages and budget cuts. She wore a plain brown coat, her hair tied neatly under a scarf, a notebook in her lap. The room smelled of pipe smoke and impatience. When the mayor finished, she stood up. "My name is Eleanor Carter," she said, her voice calm but cutting through the murmurs like steel. "I built shelters for the Navy, thousands of them, fast, cheap, and strong enough to survive typhoons. They can be homes for families now." Laughter rippled through the crowd. One man, Frank Dalton, a heavyset developer with slicked-back hair and a cigar clamped between his teeth, leaned back in his chair. "Lady, you can't house families in tin barrels." "They're not barrels," Ellie said evenly. "They're arches. They were built to protect men from bombs and storms. I think they can handle winter in Rhode Island." Frank chuckled, smoke curling from his mouth. "And who's gonna live in a war hut? People want white fences, not army leftovers." A murmur of agreement filled the hall, but Margaret, sitting in the corner, gave her daughter a nod, a small, unshakable vote of confidence. Ellie held her ground. People want roofs, they want dignity, and right now, they'll take both wherever they can find them. 2 days later, Ellie found herself driving down a muddy back road toward an abandoned naval storage yard outside Warwick. Her old friend Anthony Rossi, an Italian-American welder from her wartime team, waited by the chain-link gate. He was in his early 40s now, his face more lined, his hands scarred from years of torch work. He grinned when he saw her. "Heard you were back. Didn't think you'd stay out of trouble long." Ellie laughed softly. "You still have that old blowtorch?" "For you? Always." The yard was littered with rows of dismantled huts, stacked like forgotten relics, curved panels rusting under frost, bolts scattered like bones. Ellie ran her hand along one sheet of steel, cold and smooth. "They deserve better," she said quietly. Anthony nodded. "So, what's the plan, boss?" She looked at the horizon where smoke from home chimneys curled upward. "We build homes, real ones, out of these." Within weeks, she was back in motion. She filed paperwork, borrowed tools, convinced the War Assets Administration to sell her surplus huts at scrap value. She named the initiative Homes for Heroes. Flyers went out across the state. Affordable housing for veterans and families. Fast construction, warm, safe, dignified. Her first recruits were former soldiers, men who had slept beneath her huts in the Pacific. Among them was Jack Monroe, a carpenter in his 30s, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He had been a sergeant before the war ended abruptly for him in Okinawa, when an explosion took part of his hearing and most of his patience. Yet when Ellie spoke, he listened. "You gave us shelter out there," he said, gripping her hand. "Let me help build 'em here." They started small, 5 huts on a patch of empty land near the Pawtuxet River. Ellie designed wooden facades for the ends, added chimneys, insulation, and bright paint. Blue, green, yellow. Children ran between them as the veterans worked, hammering and laughing. The first night the lights came on, the curved rows glowed like lanterns in the snow. By spring, Homes for Heroes spread beyond Rhode Island. Reporters came. One afternoon, a photographer from Life magazine arrived, a woman named Clara Whitmore, short, brisk, with dark hair tucked under a wool beret. Her camera hung around her neck like an extension of her hand. You're Ellie Carter? She asked, stepping over a pile of lumber. The one who built the huts in Guam? Ellie hesitated. I designed them, yes, but it was a team effort. Clara smiled faintly. Sure, but your name's the one people remember. She raised her camera. Smile. You just turned a war machine into a home. The shutter clicked. That evening, Ellie walked through the finished neighborhood, rows of curved houses glowing under streetlights. She stopped in front of a bright yellow hut where laughter spilled from the doorway. A little girl peeked out, a child with dark curls and a missing front tooth. Mom says thank you, Miss Carter, she shouted before darting back inside. Ellie smiled, though her chest tightened with something close to ache. She realized she'd spent the war building for survival, but now she was building for hope. Each painted arch, each garden sprouting by a doorway, was proof that from steel and wreckage could grow life again. A week later, Life magazine hit the stands. On its cover, a color photograph of a yellow Ellie hut under a blue sky, a family standing proudly outside. The headline read, "The Woman Who Housed a Nation." Ellie saw it in a shop window and froze. Strangers on the street pointed, smiling. Her mother cried when she brought the magazine home, clutching it as if it were scripture. Anthony showed it to every worker on site, grinning like a proud brother. But Ellie felt something quieter, a blend of pride and disbelief. She thought of the war, the men lost, the storms survived, and the steel that refused to bend. As snow began to fall again that night, she sat by the window of her small apartment overlooking the river. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of peace settle on her shoulders. Outside, in the distance, the curved roofs of her huts gleamed under the moonlight. Soft, enduring, eternal. She whispered to herself, "We finally built something that lasts." Tom Tat, Tieng Viet, Num, 1945, Chien Trant Ket Tuk. Ellie Trove Rhode Island, Nhan Ranuak, Mai Jang Kung Hoang Hao Choku Bin. Ko Sang Lap, Homes for Heroes, Tai Shekes, Nhetep Kwan Joy, Tain Nagyare Cho, Giajin Lin. Voice Ugiub Jokwa, Anthony Rossiva, Jack Monroe. Hang Trum Mai Vom, Jamo Sakmok, Lane Kwan Than Fo. Hinch An Mut Ellie Hut, Mo Vang Sung Dong Chu. The Woman Who Housed a Nation, Xuat Hien Tranbia Tav Chi Life. A thin mist rolled across the valley in western Oregon, the kind that blurs the line between earth and sky. Morning sunlight pressed weakly through clouds, lighting fields of wet grass and small curved roofs dotting the hills like silver shells. Eleanor Ellie Carter stood at the edge of a dirt road, her wool coat damp at the cuffs, her hair, now streaked with gray, tucked beneath a faded hat. She was 60 years old, though she carried herself like someone still half in motion. Her hands, calloused and veined, clutched a small notebook. She had come here to see what was left of her legacy. 2 decades had passed since her huts had graced the covers of magazines. In that time, America had changed its mind about beauty. The post-war dream had turned to straight lines, glass walls, and angular silhouettes. Modern living, the advertisement said. Her once revolutionary arches were now dismissed as relics, symbols of poverty, or worse, of a bygone war no one wanted to remember. Ellie had watched her name fade from the newspapers, watched developers tear down her communities to make room for boxy suburban homes. Homes for heroes had quietly dissolved, and she, tired of the noise and pity, had packed her things and left for the quiet hills of Oregon. The small town she lived near, Maple Hollow, population 1,200, was a place where time slowed. Main Street had a single diner, 2 gas pumps, and a feed store with a bell over the door. Ellie had bought a modest cabin there, half hidden behind cedar trees, where she could tinker in solitude. Sometimes the locals waved to her at the general store, calling her Miss Ellie, never realizing they were greeting the woman who once housed thousands. Her only regular visitor was Henry Caldwell, the town's mailman, a man in his early 50s with a broad frame and a neatly trimmed beard that had begun to silver at the edges. Henry was the sort who believed in punctuality and decency above all else. Widowed a decade earlier, he filled his quiet with conversation, though he spoke with a gentleness that made even silence comfortable. Still getting letters from the East, he'd remark, handing her envelopes marked with fading government seals. Old ghosts don't forget you easy, huh? Ellie would smile faintly. They forget quick enough when they want to. She spent her days sketching, drawing new variations of the curved design that had defined her life. Sometimes she imagined new materials, fiberglass, insulated polymers, structures for climates she'd never seen. The curve was always there, eternal. It was, she thought, the purest form of strength, resilience without arrogance. But in her heart, she knew no one was building them anymore. One gray afternoon in 1963, Henry stopped by with an unusual delivery, a folded newspaper from back east. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, tapping the front page where a headline read, "Modern America. Tears down the past." Beneath it was a photograph, rows of her huts being demolished by bulldozers outside Detroit. Ellie stared at the image, the arches buckled, steel curling like paper. She felt a strange hollowness, not anger, not grief, but something quieter. So, this is how history forgets. Later that night, as rain battered the tin roof of her cabin, Ellie walked outside with her lantern. The rhythmic drumming of rain against the metal filled her ears, a sound that had always soothed her. She looked out across the valley at a cluster of her old huts still standing on a nearby farm. Their owners, the Whitaker family, had refused to tear them down. Tom Whitaker, a stocky farmer in his 40s with sun-leathered skin and a perpetual squint, had once told her, "You can keep your fancy new houses. These here survived every storm we've had since my daddy's time." His wife Martha, a sturdy woman with strong arms and a kind face, always added, "They're ugly as sin, but they don't leak." Ellie cherished them for that simple honesty. That spring, the air in Maple Hollow turned strange, heavy, electric. The townspeople talked of storms forming farther south, twisting through Kansas and Oklahoma. Tornadoes were rare this far west, but the weather didn't care about rules. One humid afternoon, as Ellie was organizing old blueprints, the wind shifted. The silence outside thickened until even the birds stopped singing. Then came the sound, a distant rumble, like a freight train barreling through the clouds. Henry burst through her door, hat in hand, eyes wide. "Ellie, it's coming this way. The radio says take cover." She looked toward the horizon. A black column was descending from the clouds, turning the world to ash and thunder. Ellie's instincts, honed from years of building against disaster, took over. "The Whitakers," she said sharply. "They're right in its path." "Get in the car," Henry barked. They drove through the storm, debris flying like knives through the air. Rain lashed the windshield, trees bent sideways. They reached the Whitaker farm just as the tornado's tail whipped across the far pasture, tearing up fences and tossing hay bales skyward. Tom and Martha were huddled with their 2 children inside one of the old steel huts, the first Ellie had helped them reinforce years earlier. Henry and Ellie sprinted toward it, the wind screaming in their ears. They dove inside, slamming the door just as the sky roared. The world turned to noise. Metal groaned, earth shook, and something enormous crashed outside. Ellie clutched the children close, heart pounding. She felt the hut flex and shudder, but it held. Minutes passed, maybe hours, until the noise finally broke into silence. When they emerged, the farm was gone. The barn flattened, trees splintered, fields stripped bare. But the curved huts, 5 of them, still stood among the ruin, battered yet unbroken. Tom Whitaker looked around, stunned. "Everything's gone," he whispered. Then he turned to Ellie, voice trembling. "Except these." Ellie's throat tightened. She ran her palm along the dented steel, still warm from friction. Her design, born in the chaos of war, had once again defied destruction. The next morning, the townspeople gathered to see the wreckage. Henry stood beside her, brushing dirt from his beard. "They'll be talking about this for years," he said quietly. "You built these things to survive anything, didn't you?" Ellie shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "No, I built them to protect people. Survival's just a side effect." News of the storm spread fast. Reporters from Portland came to photograph the strange metal shelters that had outlasted nature's fury. When one young journalist, barely out of college, asked her name for the story, Ellie hesitated. "Just say an old engineer made them," she said softly. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Ellie walked through the ruins, the air still thick with the scent of rain and earth. The survivors huddled around fires, cooking what they could salvage. Children played near the arches, their laughter bright against the desolation. Ellie watched them, her heart full and heavy all at once. The wind brushed her face, carrying the faint metallic scent of her steel huts. Henry approached quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You could tell them it was you, you know. People should remember." Ellie gazed out at the curved silhouettes glinting in the sunset. "They forgot me," she murmured, her voice almost tender. "But not the curve. Tom ta tieng viet. Nhung nem di 1960 nuok my meman kachangoi nhavuong vus hien jai quen lung thiet ke mai vom qua Ellie. Ko Roy, Rhode Island, Song and Dedo, Oregon, Noivai gia jean vanotrong Ellie huts. Chimot kon lok, soe dudoi abjen, toan bunhago trong vung bifa hui, shi kon hung ken hatep kong qua Ellie jung vung, ko buok gua jong jo nat mim quoi vanoi, hao jun quen toya, nhung kong quen juong kong. The morning light fell soft and golden through the pine trees that surrounded the small Oregon cottage. The year was 2010, and winter still clung to the valley, painting the fields with frost and filling the air with the scent of wet cedar. Inside the house, time moved slower than the world outside. Drafting tables stood in neat rows, covered in papers, rulers, and half-finished sketches. The metallic smell of tools and old ink lingered, mixed with the faint aroma of tea. At 97, Eleanor Ellie Carter still rose before dawn, wrapped in a thick wool sweater that had belonged to her father, and shuffled to her workbench with the same steady purpose she'd carried since 1941. Her hair was thin and white now, tied neatly in a bun. Her face, lined like a map, still carried the intensity of someone who refused to give up on form or function. Her hands shook slightly, but her mind was as sharp as the steel she once bent into arches. Ellie had lived long enough to watch her designs fade, vanish, and then, unbelievably, return. Over the years, she had received letters from architecture students, disaster relief organizations, and small-town builders. Most began the same way. "We found one of your huts still standing." She'd smile at that. The curve, she thought, always found its way back. That morning, a knock sounded on her door, light, uncertain, as though the person outside wasn't sure they should be there. Ellie adjusted her glasses and opened the door to find 3 young visitors standing on her porch, shivering slightly in the cold. They looked like engineers, she thought immediately. The practical kind. The first was Dr. Maya Torres, a woman in her early 30s with olive skin, dark hair tied into a low braid, and eyes that carried a spark of curiosity that refused to dim. She wore a thick blue parka over jeans, her ID badge from the Global Shelter Initiative clipped to her pocket. Beside her stood Ethan Liu, a Chinese-American architect in his late 20s, tall and lean, with neatly combed hair and a meticulous manner. His glasses sat perfectly straight on his nose, and every word he spoke sounded measured, careful, as though he weighed its structure before releasing it. Behind them was Carlos Ramirez, a stocky field engineer in his 40s with rough hands, a stubble beard, and a sunburnt complexion that spoke of long days spent in disaster zones. His voice was deep and steady, but his eyes were warm, the kind that carried quiet respect. Maya stepped forward first. "Miss Carter, I'm Dr. Torres. We wrote to you last month." Ellie nodded slowly, her voice soft but clear. "The Haiti Project," she said. "Come in, you'll freeze out there." They entered, brushing off the cold. The room was warm, filled with the hum of a small space heater and the faint crackle of an old radio playing a jazz station. Ellie motioned them to sit at the large drafting table, where blueprints lay scattered, like fallen leaves. "We've been sent to design emergency shelters for the earthquake survivors," Maya began, opening a large case and pulling out a rolled sheet of paper. "Our team is working on something modular, lightweight, easy to assemble. We call them refugee pods. They can ship flat and be built in a few hours." Ellie watched quietly as Maya unrolled the plans. The drawings showed curved profiles made of composite panels, locking joints, and insulated shells. She reached out with trembling fingers and traced one of the arcs. "Corrugated polycarbonate," she murmured, "and a self-supporting arch." Her lips twitched into a smile. "You're rebuilding 1942 with new materials." Ethan frowned slightly. "You mean the Quonset design?" Ellie chuckled softly. "We called it the Nissen derivative back then. The curve was everything. It wasn't just about strength. It was about forgiveness. The wind doesn't fight it. It flows. Steel understood that better than men did. Carlos leaned forward, intrigued. So you really invented these? She met his gaze, her eyes bright despite the years. Not alone. I had a team, good people, stubborn people. We built something the world needed, even if it forgot who made it. The room fell quiet. Outside, the wind sighed against the glass. Maya studied the old woman, her mind racing. She had grown up seeing the same curved shelters in refugee camps across Asia, some rusted, some rebuilt in plastic. And here she was, sitting with the person who started it all. We've been studying storm-resistant geometries, Ethan said. The arch still outperforms almost everything. Even with all our technology, we keep coming back to it. Ellie smiled again. Because the physics haven't changed. You can make it shinier, lighter, smarter, but the wind's still the same. Gravity still pulls down, and the curve still says no. Carlos laughed, rubbing his hands together. You make it sound poetic. Ellie's expression softened. It is poetic. Engineering always was, if you listen close enough. Maya reached into her bag and placed a tablet on the table, showing images from Haiti. Endless rows of tents torn apart by rain, children standing barefoot in mud, and a few prototypes of their neo-arches, gleaming under tropical sun. Ellie's face grew still. She looked at the photos for a long time, her thumb brushing over the screen. How many of these have you built? She asked quietly. About 2,000 so far, Maya said. We're hoping for funding to expand to Africa next year. Ellie nodded slowly, eyes glistening. Do they hold up? Better than anything else we've tried, Ethan replied. 2 people can build one in 4 hours. The structure flexes under pressure instead of breaking. A silence hung in the air, filled only by the ticking of the old clock. Ellie's gaze drifted toward her workshop in the back, where her last unfinished model waited. A new iteration she'd been tinkering with, smaller, simpler, designed for homes rather than war. She wanted to tell them about it, but instead she asked, Do you know why I built mine? Maya tilted her head. To protect soldiers? Ellie shook her head. To protect anyone. The world thinks engineers build for governments, but I built for people, for mothers trying to keep their children dry, for men who'd lost everything and needed 4 walls to feel human again. Carlos leaned back, nodding. That's exactly what we're trying to do. Ellie studied him, the dust on his boots, the scars on his knuckles, and smiled faintly. Then, you're already winning. They talked for hours, about design tolerances, anchor points, the history of the huts that had survived wars and hurricanes. As dusk approached, the visitors prepared to leave. Maya lingered at the doorway. Miss Carter, she said softly, we'd like to name our new design after you, the Carter Curve. Ellie laughed, a low, warm sound. No, dear, name it after the curve itself. It was here long before me, and it'll outlive us both. They said their goodbyes, promising to send updates from the field. When the car disappeared down the road, Ellie returned to her bench. The sky outside had turned the color of steel before rain. She sat slowly, her joints aching, and unfolded her own final blueprint. A single-room curved home, simple enough for anyone to build, drawn with her precise, deliberate lines. Her pencil moved, slow but sure, across the paper, shading the last arc. The radio murmured softly in the background. Ellie felt a calm she hadn't known in years. She thought of the huts in Guam, the families in Oregon, the children in Haiti, all under the same sheltering curve. She smiled, her breath steady, and let her hand rest gently on the blueprint. The pencil slipped from her fingers and rolled to the floor. When Henry Caldwell, now an old man himself, came by the next morning to bring her mail, he found her like that. Peaceful, eyes closed, the plans beneath her hand glowing faintly in the morning light. The Martian dawn rose like an ember across the horizon, thin, fragile light piercing the dust-filled air, scattering over the red plains. The silence was unlike anything on Earth, vast, hollow, almost sacred. In that stillness, the colony of Ares I stood, a constellation of silver domes half buried in ochre sand, their curves gleaming faintly beneath the weak sunlight. Each structure was built from composite alloys, designed to flex under pressure, to breathe under radiation, to bend without breaking. a design philosophy born nearly a century earlier from the mind of Eleanor Carter. Inside the main habitat, Lieutenant Ava Moreno tightened the final bolt on an airlock seal. She was 34, tall and wiry, her copper-toned skin catching the artificial light. Years of astronaut training had left her movements precise and economical, but her face carried softness, brown eyes that searched deeply, lips that held the habit of smiling even when she was exhausted. Her hair, once long, was now cropped short under her helmet, a practical decision that made her look sharper, almost severe. Yet beneath that hardened efficiency lay the quiet awe of someone who still couldn't believe she was alive to see Mars. Ava straightened, exhaling slowly, the hiss of her oxygen regulator the only sound. The interior of the dome glowed silver white, clean lines meeting perfect arcs. She had spent 5 months helping assemble it, module by module, curve by curve. And now, standing in its center, she felt something ancient stir within her, a strange sense of kinship with a woman she had never met. "Commander Hayes!" Ava's voice came through the comm line, low but steady. "Structure integrity check complete. Habitat 3 is sealed." A crackle, then a deep voice replied, measured and calm. Commander Thomas Hayes was in his mid-40s, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose presence filled a room even through a radio signal. His jaw was square, flecked with a day's stubble, and his gray eyes seemed carved from the same steel as the habitat domes. He had been a test pilot before joining the mission, a man shaped by loss and discipline. He rarely spoke of his wife, who had died in a shuttle explosion 15 years earlier, but the grief lingered in his silences. It made him stoic, sometimes distant, but fiercely protective of his crew. "Copy that, Lieutenant," he said. "Bring the plaque. We'll install it now." Ava turned toward the equipment bay where Dr. Ren Ito, the mission structural engineer, was hunched over a tablet. Ren was 40, short, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind round glasses that never seemed to stay clean. His black hair stood at odd angles, permanently tousled by his helmet. Brilliant and absent-minded, he was known for muttering equations under his breath, the way a musician hums melodies. He handed Ava a small titanium plaque, its surface etched with laser precision. She read the words again, her fingers brushing the cold metal. "In memory of Eleanor Carter, who proved that strength lies in the curve." Ren smiled faintly. "Fitting, isn't it? Without her designs, we'd still be living in pressurized tin cans." Ava nodded, cradling the plaque as though it were something fragile. She never even knew this would happen. She just built what the world needed then. Ren shrugged. "That's what visionaries do. They build for tomorrow without realizing how far tomorrow will reach." The airlock cycled with a low hiss, and they stepped outside into the rust-colored expanse. The wind carried fine grains of red dust that shimmered like fire under the sun. The colony stretched before them, 7 domes, perfectly curved, anchored into the ground, with reinforced arches that gleamed silver against the desolate world. Commander Hayes was already there, his figure outlined against the pale light. The wind tugged gently at the edge of his suit, scattering sand around his boots. As Ava and Ren approached, he gestured toward the largest dome, the command habitat. "This one's the heart," he said quietly. "It keeps everyone alive. Seems right to honor her here." Ava nodded. Together, they knelt by the entrance hatch. The plaque fit perfectly into its slot, the letters reflecting the faint sunlight. Hayes held the final bolt, passing it to Ava. "You should do it," he said. She hesitated. "Sir?" "You're the youngest on this crew," he replied, his tone softening. "You'll be the one to carry this forward." Her heart swelled with something she couldn't quite name. Pride, reverence, a quiet connection to a woman from another century. With careful precision, she tightened the bolt. The wrench clicked, and the sound echoed softly in her helmet. The plaque caught the light, glowing against the curve of the dome. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Mars stretched endlessly around them, red and silent, the horizon blurring into dust. Ren finally broke the stillness. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "Carter was designing for soldiers in the 1940s, then for refugees, then for disaster zones. She probably never imagined this." Ava smiled behind her visor. Maybe she did. Maybe she understood that the curve doesn't just protect, it endures. Hayes looked up at the shining arc above them, his breath fogging the inside of his helmet. She built for survival, and survival, he said, is the closest thing we have to faith. They stood in silence, listening to the faint hum of life support systems, the steady rhythm of oxygen pumps, the whisper of filtered air. Inside those domes, humanity had built a new heartbeat on another world. Later that evening, Ava sat alone in her quarters, a small circular room illuminated by soft light panels. A framed photo floated in the microgravity beside her, an image from an old history book. Eleanor Carter in her workshop, gray-haired and smiling, blueprints spread before her like a map of dreams. Ava reached out and steadied the photo, tracing the edges with her fingertips. "Thank you," she whispered. Her thoughts wandered to Earth, to the stories her grandmother used to tell about the old Ellie huts still standing in rural Oregon. She imagined how those curved roofs had sheltered families through storms, wars, and generations. And now, the same curves shielded her on Mars. It was as if the spirit of that design, the belief that safety could be beautiful, had traveled through time itself, carried by human hands and stubborn hope. Across the colony, Commander Hayes was logging mission reports. The words blurred slightly before his eyes, fatigue pressing against him. He paused, glancing through the observation port at the domes glowing silver under the twin moons, Phobos and Deimos. He thought of his wife, of all the fragile things that broke under pressure, and how, somehow, this place didn't. "Strength lies in the curve," he murmured. He smiled, a rare thing, small and genuine. Outside, the wind settled. The temperature dropped sharply, and the surface turned to shadow. The domes stood like silent sentinels under the alien sky, reflecting the faint light of distant Earth, tiny, blue, and shimmering on the horizon. In that vast stillness, humanity's legacy breathed quietly, cradled beneath steel and sand. The curves that once saved soldiers, sheltered families, and withstood tornadoes now guarded the pioneers of a new world. Mars slept beneath its silver arches, and the red planet glowed softly, a symbol of endurance, of the timeless bond between creation and survival. Somewhere, in that glow, it felt as though Eleanor Carter's spirit watched, not as a ghost, but as an echo of every curve that had ever protected a life. And in the infinite silence of space, her lesson endured. Strength lies in the curve.